In 1940, France possessed what military analysts considered the strongest army in Europe. The French had learned the lessons of World War I. They had fortified their border with Germany through the Maginot Line, a system of concrete bunkers and artillery positions designed to make invasion impossible. They had mobilized over 3 million men. They had more tanks than Germany, many of them superior in armor and firepower. French military doctrine emphasized methodical warfare, firepower, and defense in depth. The assumption was that any German offensive would follow the pattern of 1914, a sweep through Belgium that could be met and contained by French and British forces advancing into prepared positions. Between the Maginot Line and the Belgian border lay the Ardennes Forest, a heavily wooded, hilly region spanning southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg. French planners designated the Ardennes as a secondary sector. The terrain was considered unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations. The roads were narrow, winding, and inadequate for the movement of armored divisions. The forests and rivers created natural obstacles that would slow or halt any advance. French intelligence assessments concluded that it would take Germany at least 9 to 10 days to move significant forces through the Ardennes, providing ample time for French reserves to respond. The sector was therefore lightly defended, held by second-rate divisions with minimal artillery and no armored support. On May 10, 1940, at 05:35 hours, 3 German Panzer Corps, 134,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of vehicles began moving through the Ardennes. Within 48 hours, the lead elements had crossed the entire forest, reached the Meuse River at Sedan, and established bridgeheads on the western bank. The French strategic assumption that the Ardennes was impassable for armor had been proven catastrophically wrong. The speed of the German advance exceeded every French estimate. The breakthrough at Sedan would lead to the encirclement of the entire Allied Northern Army Group in the fall of France within 6 weeks. This analysis examines how Germany moved 3 Panzer Corps through terrain deemed impassable, why French intelligence failed to detect or respond to the movement, and how a 48-hour march through a forest destroyed the French defensive system. The facts are documented in German operational records, French military archives, and post-war interrogations. What follows is the operational breakdown of the breakthrough that should not have been possible. The French assessment of the Ardennes as unsuitable for armored operations was not baseless. The region's geography presented genuine obstacles to mechanized movement. The Ardennes consists of densely forested hills, narrow river valleys, and limited road infrastructure. The terrain rises to elevations exceeding 500 meters, with steep gradients unsuitable for heavy vehicles. The road network in 1940 was designed for local traffic, not military logistics. Primary routes were 2-lane roads with sharp curves, narrow bridges, and gradients that posed challenges for tanks and supply trucks. French military planners evaluated the Ardennes using the experience of World War I, when movement through difficult terrain had been slow and logistically complex. The assumption was that any German force attempting to traverse the Ardennes would be constrained by the same factors. Intelligence estimates calculated that moving a single panzer division through the forest would require at least 3 days, assuming optimal conditions. Moving multiple divisions simultaneously would create massive traffic congestion, turning the narrow roads into immobile columns, vulnerable to air attack and artillery interdiction. The French also assumed that even if German forces could traverse the Ardennes, they would arrive at the Meuse River disorganized, low on fuel, and unable to conduct immediate offensive operations. The Meuse presented a significant water obstacle, 60 to 100 meters wide, with steep banks and limited crossing points. French doctrine held that any force emerging from the Ardennes would need days to organize bridging equipment, establish supply lines, and prepare for a river crossing. This delay would provide French reserves time to move north and establish defensive positions along the river. These assumptions shaped French deployments. The Ardennes sector was assigned to the French Second Army, commanded by General Charles Hunsiger. Second Army consisted of 9 infantry divisions, most of them B-series reserve formations, with older equipment and limited training. The Army's mission was to hold the Meuse River line and delay any German advance long enough for reserves to arrive. The expectation was that Second Army would face, at most, limited German reconnaissance elements or diversionary attacks. The main German offensive was anticipated in Belgium, where French and British forces were positioned to advance and meet the expected thrust. German planners, however, viewed the Ardennes differently. Reconnaissance conducted in the 1930s had identified routes through the forest capable of supporting armored movement if properly organized. The key was not whether the terrain allowed passage, but whether German logistics and traffic control could move large formations rapidly enough to achieve operational surprise. The German assessment concluded that with meticulous planning, strict march discipline, and concentration of forces on a limited number of routes, a rapid transit was feasible. The risk was significant, but the operational payoff, bypassing the Maginot Line and striking the weakest point in the French defensive system, justified the gamble. The French assumption that the Ardennes was impassable reflected doctrinal rigidity and an institutional failure to adapt to the operational possibilities of mechanized warfare. French planners projected their own limitations onto the enemy. They assumed that because France would find the movement difficult, Germany would as well. This assumption was the foundation of the entire French defensive strategy. When it proved incorrect, the consequences were catastrophic. The German plan to attack through the Ardennes was not the original operational concept for the invasion of France. The initial plan, Vol Gelb, prepared in late 1939, called for a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, a strong right wing advancing through Belgium and the Netherlands, pushing Allied forces back into France. This plan was predictable, and French intelligence anticipated it. The plan also offered limited strategic results. Even if successful, it would drive Allied forces westward, but would not achieve decisive encirclement or destruction. In February 1940, a revised plan was adopted based on a proposal by Generalleutnant Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff to Army Group A. Manstein's concept reversed the operational priorities. Instead of making the main effort in Belgium, the primary thrust would occur through the Ardennes, targeting the weakest point in the French line. The objective was not simply to defeat French forces, but to encircle and destroy the Allied Northern Army Group by driving rapidly to the English Channel, cutting off British and French forces in Belgium. The plan assigned the main effort to Army Group A, commanded by Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt. Army Group A would commit 3 Panzer Corps, 7 Panzer divisions in total, through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River at Sedan and Dinant, and drive west toward the Channel coast. The concentration of armor was unprecedented. German doctrine emphasized mass at the point of attack, and Manstein's plan applied this principle at the operational level. The 3 Panzer Corps were Panzergruppe Kleist, consisting of Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps and Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps, and Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps, operating independently to the north. Guderian's Corps, the spearhead, included the 1st, 2nd, and 10th Panzer Divisions, supported by motorized infantry and engineers. The Corps was tasked with crossing the Meuse at Sedan and exploiting westward. Reinhardt's Corps, with the 6th and 8th Panzer Divisions, would cross near Montaimet. Hoth's Corps, with the 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions, would cross at Dinant. The operational timeline was aggressive. The Panzer Corps were to reach the Meuse within 48 to 72 hours of crossing the German border, establish bridgeheads, and continue the advance without pausing for infantry or supply columns to catch up. Speed was essential. The plan depended on achieving operational surprise, crossing the Meuse before French reserves could react, and maintaining momentum to prevent the French from stabilizing a defensive line. Logistical planning was meticulous. Routes through the Ardennes were surveyed and assigned to specific divisions. Traffic control points were established to prevent congestion. Engineer units were pre-positioned to repair bridges and clear obstacles. fuel and ammunition dumps were stockpiled near the Belgian border. Each panzer division carried sufficient fuel and supplies for 3 days of operations, calculated to reach the Meuse and establish bridgeheads without resupply. The plan also incorporated deception. German forces in northern Germany simulated preparations for an offensive into the Netherlands, reinforcing Allied expectations that the main attack would occur in the north. Luftwaffe operations targeted Belgian and Dutch air bases, further directing Allied attention away from the Ardennes.
The concentration of Panzer Corps in the forests of the Eifel region, east of the Ardennes, was concealed through movement at night and strict radio silence. The success of the plan required precise execution, disciplined movement, and the willingness to accept operational risk. If French forces detected the movement and responded rapidly, the panzer columns, strung out on narrow roads with limited maneuver space, could be vulnerable to flanking attacks or air interdiction. If the Meuse crossings failed, the offensive would stall. Manstein's plan was audacious, but it exploited French assumptions and concentrated German strength at the point of maximum enemy weakness. The question was whether German forces could execute the plan faster than the French could react. Moving 3 Panzer Corps through the Ardennes required solving a logistics and traffic control problem of unprecedented complexity. The German forces committed to the operation included approximately 41,000 vehicles, tanks, armored cars, trucks, artillery prime movers, motorcycles, and staff cars, moving on a limited road network with minimal capacity for lateral movement. A single traffic jam or bottleneck could halt the entire operation, leaving columns vulnerable and destroying the operational timeline. German planners divided the Ardennes into sectors, assigning specific routes to each division. The primary routes were identified through reconnaissance and engineer surveys conducted in the months before the offensive. 3 main axes were designated. The southern route, through Luxembourg and southern Belgium, was assigned to Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps. The central route, through the Semois River Valley, was assigned to Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps. The northern route, through northern Luxembourg and Belgium, was assigned to Haut's 15th Panzer Corps. Each route was further subdivided into lanes, with divisions moving in parallel where possible to reduce congestion. Traffic control was enforced through military police detachments positioned at every crossroads and intersection. These detachments, equipped with radios and signal flags, directed movement, prevented units from deviating from assigned routes, and resolved bottlenecks. The authority of traffic control officers was absolute. Divisional commanders were prohibited from altering routes without authorization from Corps headquarters. Vehicles were required to maintain prescribed intervals to prevent clustering. Units that fell behind schedule were bypassed rather than allowed to slow the column. Engineer units moved ahead of the main columns, repairing bridges, clearing obstacles, and marking routes. Belgian engineers had demolished some bridges in an attempt to slow the German advance, but German pioneers carried prefabricated bridge sections and bridging equipment capable of spanning gaps of up to 30 meters. In cases where bridges could not be quickly repaired, fords were identified and marked. Tanks and armored vehicles crossed rivers directly. Wheeled vehicles used temporary bridges or waited for repairs. Fuel was the critical constraint. A panzer division consumed approximately 30,000 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of movement. The distance from the German border to the Meuse at Sedan was approximately 100 kilometers, requiring each division to carry or have access to sufficient fuel for the transit and initial combat operations. Fuel trucks moved interspersed with combat units rather than in rear area supply columns, ensuring that tanks could refuel without halting. Additional fuel dumps were established along the routes, restocked by follow-on logistics units. Movement discipline was strictly enforced. Divisions moved in march columns with prescribed intervals between vehicles. Halts were scheduled and coordinated to prevent units from blocking routes. When halts occurred, vehicles pulled to the side of the road to allow others to pass. Reconnaissance elements moved ahead of the main columns, identifying obstacles and enemy positions. Combat engagements were avoided when possible, The priority was speed, not destruction of isolated Belgian or French units. The Luftwaffe provided air cover, conducting fighter sweeps over the Ardennes to prevent Allied reconnaissance aircraft from observing the columns. Ground attack aircraft suppressed Belgian defensive positions and interdicted French reinforcements attempting to move north. The coordination between ground and air forces was effective, preventing Allied air forces from disrupting the movement. The result of this planning was that German forces moved through the Ardennes faster than French intelligence believed possible. The columns were visible from the air, long lines of vehicles stretching for kilometers, but Allied air reconnaissance was limited, and the reports that were filed were not prioritized by French High Command. By the time French commanders recognized the scale of the movement, German lead elements were already at the Meuse. The logistical and traffic control operation was not perfect. Bottlenecks occurred, units were delayed, and some vehicles broke down. But the overall execution achieved the operational objective: delivery of 3 Panzer Corps to the Meuse River within 48 hours of crossing the German border. At 05:35 hours on May 10, 1940, the German invasion of France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg began. Luftwaffe bombers struck Allied airfields across Belgium and France. Paratroopers seized key bridges in Belgium and the Netherlands. Ground forces crossed the borders simultaneously along a 300-kilometer front. The Allied response was immediate. French and British forces executed Plan D, advancing into Belgium to meet the expected German thrust. This was exactly what German planners had anticipated. In the Ardennes, the movement of Panzergruppe Kleist commenced with the crossing of the Luxembourg border. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps led the advance, followed by Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps. The columns moved through Luxembourg with minimal resistance. Luxembourg had no army and did not attempt to defend its territory. Belgian forces in the Ardennes were light screening units tasked with delaying, not stopping a German advance. These units conducted minor demolitions, blowing bridges and felling trees across roads, but were quickly overrun or bypassed. The first significant obstacle was the Belgian Chasseurs Ardennais, a light infantry regiment deployed in the forests to delay German forces. The Chasseurs conducted ambushes, demolitions, and delaying actions, forcing German engineers to clear routes and repair bridges. These actions slowed the advance by hours, not days. German doctrine emphasized bypassing resistance when possible and suppressing it with overwhelming firepower when necessary. Infantry and motorized units engaged the Belgian delaying forces, while panzer units continued the advance on parallel routes. By the afternoon of May 10th, German lead elements had penetrated 40 to 50 kilometers into the Ardennes. The columns were spread across hundreds of kilometers of road, with individual units separated by gaps but moving on synchronized timelines. Traffic control was effective, and bottlenecks, while present, were resolved quickly. Fuel consumption was within projected parameters. The weather was clear, allowing Luftwaffe reconnaissance to monitor routes and provide air support where needed. French intelligence received reports of German movement through the Ardennes on May 10th. Aerial reconnaissance flights observed vehicle columns, and Belgian units transmitted contact reports before being overrun. However, the scale and direction of the movement were not immediately clear. French High Command, focused on the German offensive into Belgium and the Netherlands, interpreted the Ardennes movement as a diversionary attack or a supporting effort. The assumption that the Ardennes was impassable for large armored formations shaped the interpretation of intelligence. Reports of German armor in the forest were acknowledged but not prioritized. General Hunziker, commanding French Second Army along the Meuse, was informed of German activity in the Ardennes but did not request reinforcements or alter his defensive dispositions. French doctrine called for reserves to be committed only when the direction and weight of the German main effort were confirmed. Since the main effort was believed to be in Belgium, reserves remained positioned to move north, not east, toward the Meuse at Sedan. By nightfall on May 10th,
German panzer units had advanced approximately 60 kilometers from the border. The lead elements were approaching the Semois River, a tributary of the Meuse. The operational timeline was on track. The columns had moved faster than French estimates, and the element of surprise, while not total, was sufficient to prevent a French counter-response. The French defensive system, predicated on the assumption that German forces would take 9 to 10 days to traverse the Ardennes, had already failed. The Germans had covered more than half the distance in less than 24 hours. On May 11th, the advance continued. German panzer units crossed the Semois River, the last significant obstacle before the Meuse. Belgian engineers had demolished bridges, but German pioneers constructed temporary crossings or identified fords. The Semois was not heavily defended. Belgian forces had withdrawn westward, and French units had not yet moved forward to occupy defensive positions along the river. The crossing was contested, but not stopped. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, driving toward Sedan, reached the outskirts of the town by the afternoon of May 12th. The speed of the advance exceeded even German expectations. Guderian had originally estimated reaching the Meuse on May 13th or 14th.
The accelerated timeline was the result of effective traffic control, minimal resistance, and the decision to bypass isolated Belgian strongpoints rather than reduce them systematically. French forces defending the Meuse at Sedan consisted of the 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions, both B-series reserve formations. These divisions were under strength, equipped with obsolete weapons, and had received limited training. The defensive line along the Meuse was incomplete. Bunkers and obstacles existed, but they were not mutually supporting, and many positions lacked adequate fields of fire. The defenses were designed to delay an enemy crossing, not to repel a concentrated assault by armor and infantry supported by air power. French commanders at Sedan were aware of German movement through the Ardennes, but did not expect an immediate assault. Intelligence estimates continued to project that German forces would require several days to organize a crossing. The 55th Division's command post reported German reconnaissance activity on the eastern bank of the Meuse on the evening of May 12th, but did not request artillery support or airstrikes. The assumption was that the crossing attempt would occur on May 14th or later, providing time to prepare. Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps reached the Meuse near Monthermé on May 12th. Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps reached the river at Dinant. Along a 100-kilometer front, 3 German Panzer Corps had arrived at the Meuse within 48 hours of crossing the German border. The operational objective of the first phase, rapid transit through the Ardennes, had been achieved. The next phase would be the most critical, forcing a crossing under fire and establishing bridgeheads before French reserves could counterattack. French High Command on May 12th still believed the main German effort was in Belgium. Reports of German armor at the Meuse were received but interpreted as screening forces or reconnaissance elements. The possibility that 7 panzer divisions had moved through the Ardennes and were preparing to cross the Meuse simultaneously was not considered credible. French doctrine and institutional assumptions prevented commanders from accepting the operational reality unfolding at Sedan. By the time the error was recognized, German forces were already crossing the river. The failure of French intelligence to detect, interpret, or respond to the German movement through the Ardennes was not due to a lack of information. French reconnaissance aircraft photographed German columns. Belgian forces transmitted contact reports. Radio intercepts detected German signals traffic. Intelligence officers compiled reports documenting German activity in the forest. The failure was institutional and interpretive. French commanders received accurate information, but filtered it through assumptions that rendered it meaningless. The primary assumption was that the Ardennes was impassable for armor. This assumption was so deeply embedded in French strategic planning that contradictory evidence was dismissed or reinterpreted. When aerial reconnaissance reported large vehicle columns in the Ardennes on May 10th, the reports were acknowledged, but assessed as describing infantry or supply units, not panzer divisions. The possibility that Germany would commit its primary armored force through terrain deemed unsuitable was not seriously considered. French intelligence assessments on May 10th and 11th concluded that the German movement through the Ardennes was a supporting effort designed to pin French forces in place while the main attack developed in Belgium. This interpretation aligned with French expectations and with the pattern of the 1914 invasion. Intelligence officers predicted that German forces in the Ardennes would advance slowly, requiring at least a week to reach the Meuse. Even when German units were reported at the Semois River on May 11th, 2 days ahead of French projections, the assessments were not revised. The assumption that the Ardennes imposed delays remained unchallenged. Communication failures compounded the intelligence problem. Belgian forces fighting delaying actions in the Ardennes transmitted reports of German armor, but these reports were not systematically forwarded to French High Command or were deprioritized in favor of intelligence from Belgium. French Second Army headquarters at Sedan received fragmentary reports of German movements but lacked a complete operational picture. The Army's intelligence staff was small, under-resourced, and focused on immediate tactical threats rather than operational-level analysis. French aerial reconnaissance was limited by weather, Luftwaffe air superiority, and doctrinal constraints. Reconnaissance flights over the Ardennes on May 10th and 11th observed German columns but could not determine unit identities or the scale of the movement. The aircraft that returned from reconnaissance missions reported traffic jams and vehicle concentrations, but these observations were interpreted as evidence that German forces were experiencing the delays French planners had predicted. The possibility that the traffic represented the movement of entire panzer corps, not logistical difficulties, was not considered. The institutional culture of French High Command reinforced these failures. French military doctrine emphasized centralized control and methodical planning. Junior officers were discouraged from independent interpretation or initiatives that contradicted established plans. Intelligence officers who reported German armor at unexpected locations or timelines were questioned, or their reports were downgraded. The result was that accurate intelligence was filtered, delayed, or ignored as it moved up the chain of command. By May 12th, when German forces reached the Meuse, French intelligence had compiled sufficient information to recognize that the main German effort was occurring in the Ardennes, not Belgium. But institutional inertia and doctrinal rigidity prevented this recognition from translating into operational decisions. French reserves remained positioned to move north into Belgium. Artillery and air support were committed to the northern sector. The Meuse defenses at Sedan, manned by reserve divisions, were not reinforced. The intelligence failure was complete, and the operational consequences would be catastrophic. On May 13, 1940, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps launched the assault to cross the Meuse at Sedan. The operation began at 1600 hours with a concentrated air attack by Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers. Over 300 aircraft struck French positions along the river, targeting bunkers, artillery emplacements, observation posts, and troop concentrations. The bombardment lasted 3 hours. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. French defenders, many of whom had never experienced sustained air attack, were demoralized and disoriented. The ground assault commenced at 1900 hours. German infantry from the 1st Panzer Division's Schützen Regiment crossed the Meuse in rubber assault boats under covering fire from machine guns, mortars, and direct-fire artillery positioned on the eastern bank. French defensive fire was sporadic and uncoordinated. Many bunkers had been damaged by the air attack. Communication lines had been severed. Officers and NCOs had been killed or were isolated in their positions. The 55th Division, defending the sector, was unable to mount a cohesive defense. German engineers worked under fire to construct pontoon bridges capable of supporting tanks and vehicles. By midnight, the first bridge was operational. Tanks from the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions crossed the river and began expanding the bridgehead. French counterattacks, launched piecemeal by isolated companies and battalions, were defeated by combined German armor and infantry. By dawn on May 14th, the bridgehead at Sedan extended several kilometers west of the Meuse and was secure enough to allow the continuous movement of reinforcements and supplies. Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps attempted crossings near Monthermé on May 13th, but encountered stronger resistance. The terrain was less favorable, and French defenses were more intact. The crossings succeeded on May 14th, after additional air support and the arrival of heavy artillery. Haut's 15th Panzer Corps crossed at Dinant on May 13th, achieving a bridgehead with assistance from Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, which conducted an aggressive assault that overwhelmed French defenders. The French response to the Meuse crossings was delayed and uncoordinated. French High Command, still focused on the situation in Belgium, did not recognize the operational significance of the Sedan bridgehead until May 14th. By then, German forces were already exploiting westward. French reserves, armored and motorized divisions that could have mounted effective counterattacks, were out of position, committed to operations in Belgium, or held in reserve for a threat that never materialized. The French 3rd Armored Division and 3rd Motorized Division were ordered to counterattack the Sedan bridgehead on May 14th. But coordination failures, fuel shortages, and Luftwaffe attacks disrupted the movement. The counterattacks were launched piecemeal, without infantry or artillery support, and were defeated by German anti-tank guns and airstrikes. By May 15th, the opportunity to contain the bridgehead had passed. German panzer divisions were driving west, at speeds exceeding 40 kilometers per day, far faster than French forces could react. The crossing at Sedan was not inevitable.
French defenses, if properly manned and supported, could have contested the crossing and delayed German forces long enough for reserves to arrive. But the combination of poor quality troops, inadequate preparation, overwhelming German air superiority, and French command failures created conditions for a rapid German breakthrough. The crossing at Sedan, achieved within 24 hours of reaching the river, validated every element of the Manstein Plan. The French defensive system, predicated on delays that never occurred, collapsed. The German breakthrough at Sedan destroyed the operational foundation of the French defensive strategy. Within 72 hours of crossing the Meuse, German panzer divisions had penetrated 80 kilometers into French territory, reaching Montcornet and threatening the rear of the entire Allied Northern Army group. French attempts to establish successive defensive lines failed because German forces moved faster than French reserves could deploy. The doctrine of methodical warfare, designed for predictable, slow-moving offensives, could not respond to the tempo of armored exploitation. On May 16th, German forces reached the Oise River. On May 20th, lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the English Channel at Abbeville, completing the encirclement of Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and elements of the Belgian Army, over 1 million men, were cut off from supply and reinforcement. The encirclement, achieved in 10 days, was the culmination of an operational concept that began with a movement through the Ardennes. The French High Command attempted counterattacks throughout late May, but these efforts were uncoordinated, undersupplied, and defeated in detail. The French military, institutionally unprepared for rapid operational maneuver, could not adapt to the pace and scale of the German breakthrough. Reserves were committed piecemeal. Armor was dispersed rather than concentrated. Command and control broke down as headquarters were overrun or bypassed. By early June, organized French resistance in northern France had collapsed. The Ardennes breakthrough demonstrated that French assumptions about terrain, tempo, and mechanized warfare were catastrophically incorrect. The assertion that no army could cross the Ardennes rapidly had been disproven in 48 hours. The reliance on methodical defense and centralized command had been exposed as inadequate against an enemy employing operational-level maneuver and decentralized execution. The French army, despite numerical and material advantages, had been defeated, not by superior force, but by superior doctrine and operational planning. The German success in the Ardennes also validated the risks of the Manstein plan. The movement through the forest was vulnerable to detection, interdiction, and counterattack. If French intelligence had correctly interpreted the reports, if French reserves had been positioned differently, if the Meuse crossings had been contested effectively, the outcome could have been different. But the combination of German operational planning, logistical execution, and French institutional failures created conditions for a breakthrough that changed the course of the war. The Ardennes operation remains a case study in the exploitation of enemy assumptions, the importance of tempo in mechanized warfare, and the catastrophic consequences of doctrinal rigidity. The assertion that terrain alone can stop an army was proven false. What stopped armies was not forests or rivers, but the failure to adapt, to recognize operational realities, and to respond faster than the enemy could exploit. France possessed the resources to defend. It lacked the doctrine, the leadership, and the operational flexibility to use them effectively. The result was the fall of France in 6 weeks, the evacuation of British forces at Dunkirk, and the establishment of German dominance in Western Europe for 4 years.